theory-based analysis. We will build from the basic literary analysis and discuss how theory influences writing an analytical paper. As with other videos, to continue throughout each slide, you'll need to click the Continue button in the bottom right-hand corner or the Forward button at the bottom of this screen. The basic assignment is a 4 to 6 page literary analysis of a work of literature using a theory other than formalism to engage that text. Remember that you're focusing on a literary work, a poem, a piece of fiction or nonfiction. You may want to pair two texts together, but for the size of this assignment, you wouldn't want to do more than that. Just as with the basic literary analysis, you should begin with the question, how does X accomplish Y? But the X and Y are going to change with the theory, and I'll explain how that is. You're going to be building from the principles of the basic literary analysis, and it might be valuable for you to go back and review the basic literary analysis video that talks about how to structure a paragraph and other elements of doing a literary analysis. When you use literary theory, I'd have you think of it like a lens. If you've seen the movie National Treasure, there's a scene where the main character puts on a pair of glasses, and depending on if he has the green lens or the yellow lens, he sees certain things on the text. And that's the same thing with literary theory. Theory is a lens that influences what we see in the text. And the theory is implied in the questions that we ask about the text. Very rarely will you see I'm using a psychoanalysis theory statement in your paper. For example, look at these two questions that I have here. How does the movie Enchanted both fit and disrupt reader expectations regarding fairy tales? Well, that's a reader-oriented theory. I'm looking at the reader's involvement in the text and the reader's response to the text. Or the question, how does Peyton Farquhar in Occurrence at Elk Creek, how is his failed journey call into question the archetypal hero's quest? Well, I'm looking at archetypes, I'm looking at particularly the heroic journey. That's psychoanalytic theory with Jung. When you're thinking about using a literary theory with a text, it becomes a little bit of a which comes first, the theory or the text. Do you pick the theory and then find a text that fits it, or pick the theory and just fit it onto the text? Or do you read the text and then decide what theory best fits it? Sometimes the journal pushes you towards a specific theory. If you're writing for a women's studies journal, you may gravitate towards feminist theory. If you're looking at multiculturalism for a multicultural journal, well, that's the theory that you're going to use. But generally, you want to read the text and consider how different theories will highlight different issues within the text, and which of those issues are then appropriate for the particular journal's focus. When you're selecting a theory for analysis, think of theory as genre. So rather than feminist theory, we have the feminism genre, and within that genre there are many different types of theories, similar with reader-oriented response or all of the other theories that we can consider. Therefore, you need to narrow the criticism that you're going to select. For example, here I've shown how psychoanalytic criticism breaks down into many different theories. We have Freud's theories, which then break down into multiple subcategories. Carl Jung with archetypes and the personal conscious, Frey, Lacan, and there are many others that form the bulk of the psychoanalytic criticism. So when you are picking that specific theory, you want to go to your textbook and find the particular aspect of that theory. Do you want to look at the id, the ego, and the superego? Do you want to look at the pleasure principle? Do you want to look at the hero cycle? All of those are components within psychoanalytic theory. Once you have narrowed your theory to a particular concept, start brainstorming questions that pair the theory with the text. Here I give 3 examples of questions you might ask about the short story, A Short Happy Life of Francis Macomber. Notice that each question uses a specific literary theory, but more importantly, see how each theory has then been narrowed to a specific aspect within that theory. Look through your theory textbook to help you identify the aspect that you want to use for your analysis. The first question uses the concept of other, which originated with Simone de Beauvoir, to look at the character of Margot. How does Margot fight against being made other, a subordinate to the male, a secondary or non-existent player in the major social institutions of her culture? The second question uses a pairing of theories, a concept of new historicism that also pulls from the concept of postcolonialism. How does Wilson's attitude toward the native bearers and servants serve as a, quote, cultural artifact of the early 20th century multiculturalism? The third question brings in Marxism with a little new historicism and looks at how does the short happy life of Francis Macomber reinforce and question social hierarchy and hegemony. Next, look at your list of questions and select the best question for your paper. Which question interests you most? Does the question meet your audience needs and purpose? With this question, you should look at your various audiences, your journal's editorial board, and your writing instructor. Does the question that you've selected fit both of those audiences? You might ask yourself, does this question fit the scope of the assignment? In other words, how long will it take you to sufficiently answer this question? If one question does not fit the scope of the assignment, you might pair 2 related questions to broaden that scope. If one question is too complex, you might need to narrow that. What are the subcomponents of that question? And then just pick one to fit the paper's assignment. Once you have your question, then you start looking for answers. The first place you'll find answers is the literature. Look at the characters, look at the plot structure, symbols, setting, and other literary devices. You might also look at the theory. Review your theory textbook. Define terms and concepts and apply these to the text. You might also choose to do other research, but this is not necessary for this assignment. As you start to find answers to your question, you may need to refine that original question. You might have to create secondary questions or narrow that scope because the answer is too complicated to put within the scope of the paper. As you look for answers, you'll start to draw conclusions about the text. For example, my question explores how Wilson, a white man in Africa, and the natives reflect the cultural attitudes about whites and non-whites during this time period. As I look at the text, what did I learn? Well, that Wilson is considered a real man. He might even be considered the hero of the text. I learned that Wilson disregards the laws for treating natives. He physically abuses them, although he's not supposed to. He's only supposed to fine them, and he looks down upon them. Based on these 2 insights, Wilson is a real man and Wilson mistreats the natives. I might conclude that white men during this time period had more power than the natives in their own country. From here, you should create a working thesis for your paper, in a sense, the answer to your question. Based on my conclusions, my working thesis is that Wilson's treatment of the native carriers, coupled with his position as quintessential man, illustrate the power of white men in society. Once you know that quintessential man just means the ultimate symbol of manhood, you'll see that my paper divides into 2 sections, Wilson's treatment of the native carriers and his symbol of manhood. In my paper, I'll show how these 2 aspects of Wilson's character develops the idea that whites had greater power in Africa during this time. With your working thesis in place, you start gathering evidence to prove your thesis is true. Like the basic literary analysis, most of your evidence for this paper will focus on the literary devices within the text. Notice that I am mostly looking at characterization. I might also look at significant symbols, or I might look at imagery, or conflict, or irony. I'll probably look at the setting of Africa, or I might choose from many of the other literary devices used in the story. Some evidence might come from the theory itself. I may define multiculturalism, I may define the concept of a cultural artifact, because that will give me the criteria to apply to my text. If I'm arguing that this is a cultural artifact for the time period, then I have to know what that means. I might tie this also to a specific quote from the text so that the theory and the text support one another. So how do you begin a theory-based analysis? Well, first you select the text and the theory. Again, the theory may come first or the text may come first. It just depends on the situation. But you want to make sure that both are appropriate for your journal. Next, you ask questions. Make sure your questions reflect the narrow concept that you've selected from your theory. Review the literature in the theory and start finding answers to your question. Develop a working thesis and find evidence to support this thesis, then start drafting. Now this list makes the process seem neat, like a checklist. Remember that you need to repeat certain steps. As you draft, you may have to find more evidence, you may need to revise your thesis, you might need to adjust the concept from the theory that you're using. Be ready to revise and rethink as you move through this process. Good luck and have fun. Using theory can help you see ideas in a text that you hadn't considered before, and that is the real fun of using theory and text in analysis.